Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Hope the week has gone well for you all. I'm Rebecca Chapman from VR Mintel. Today, we are going to be talking about pricing strategy levers with Anurag Verma, co-founder and data scientist at PriceLabs. We are also going to be recording this webinar, and we'll have it available for you at the vrdarm.com, along with our other recorded sessions from the most recent Data and Revenue Management Conference. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't purchased your 2021 Vacation Rental Women's Summit tickets yet, you still have time before late registration hits and the prices go up. That will be October 1st. So make sure you grab your tickets soon. Anurag, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Another thing I wanted to mention before we get into this is that like everybody who's joining in, feel free to ask questions as we go. And I think Rebecca is planning on monitoring those. And then if something comes up, she'll interrupt and we'll address the question as we go. Cool. Thank you everyone for joining in. What I'm covering today is the session is called Pricing Levers, Vacation Rental Revenue Managers Pool to Influence Booking Activity. And the idea is to essentially do sort of an overview of all kinds of things that revenue managers look at, what kind of data they look at, what kind of adjustments they make based on that data. But of course, this is not going to be an exhaustive list because a lot of revenue managers do a lot of new things. But what I'm trying to cover is sort of the level 1 and level 2 basics in some ways. With that in mind, as a way of quick introduction, my name is Anurag Verma. I'm one of the co-founders at PriceLabs. We are a dynamic pricing and revenue management platform for short-term rentals, integrate with a lot of property management systems in the market to essentially to let revenue managers and property managers control their prices, have them have strategies automated and things like that. So yeah. Now, before we go into the session, one of the very important things to understand is for any strategy, it's very important to define what goals we are after. Once we know what those goals are, then we can know what we are trying to do, how to get there, measure that we are getting there or not, and things like that. And in terms of how to get there, I've split things into two levers. One is pricing levers that today's session is about, which is essentially going to say, what can we do with rate? But there are, of course, a lot of other levers available for vacation rental managers. There are restrictions, there are policies. So anytime we talk about strategies, it's not just important as to what you are doing or what you're allowing, but also important to talk about what you're not allowing. So for example, if I don't want short bookings, I can use minimum stay restrictions to do that. So we are not going to speak as much about restrictions and policies. This session is more about rates themselves. And then, of course, if we have time in the end, we'll have a Q&A. If you have questions in the middle, feel free to put in your questions earlier as well. Coming to the goals. So as vacation rental managers, one of our primary goals, and this is other than making sure that the guests are very happy, is to make sure that each property owner makes the most out of their vacation homes. And when I've highlighted each here, what I mean to say is, if we have a portfolio of 100 properties, we might be doing really well as the entire portfolio. It might be booking great, but unlike many other businesses where the total revenue is what's important, in this case, it's sort of the split also matters because each home is owned by a different owner, and each home needs to be doing well. If it doesn't, then that homeowner will sooner or later decide to go elsewhere or start managing on their own. So it's not just about total revenue, it's also about each property's revenue. And that makes vacation rentals very unique, not just compared to hotels and other similar areas, but also like across all businesses, right? And then the secondary goal in some ways is again, as a vacation rental company, your revenues, your operating revenues come out of the total revenue that your portfolio makes. So of course, that is very important. And while doing that, while doing the top two, which are more focused on revenue, it's also very important to, one, keep the owner happy, and then make sure that your costs don't balloon out of control. And where this comes in is a lot of times um, you might have to put in certain strategies or certain restrictions to make sure there aren't too many turnovers happening. Like if maybe you're in a market where you can take a lot of single night bookings or 2 night bookings, and maybe that increases your revenue, but that doesn't mean that you do it because that also means that they're expensive. So we don't have to just look at revenue. We also have to look as companies at the cost aspect of it and the operations aspect of it. Like, um, do you have enough boots on the ground to make sure all the turnovers that need to be done are done correctly or well, and things like that. Now, with that in mind, one of the basic principles of pricing and revenue management that comes in is how much revenue do you expect to make out of a home on any given date, and that pretty much nobody knows. Like for a future date, I can't guarantee, nobody can guarantee that, yes, if you set this price, you will get booked, and if you set that price, you won't get booked. Um, we have seen when you do experiments with price, you'll see that generally speaking in economics, it's well understood that as you increase the price, the probability of getting booked keeps reducing. Um, Expected revenue, we think of it as take the price that you're setting for a future date, multiply it with the probability of booking, and that becomes your probability of booking. So if you set the price very cheap, your probability of booking might be very high, close to 100%. But your total revenue, so like if you set $20 a night for your property, maybe like you will get booked eventually, but the most you'll make is $20 out of that night. And on the flip side, for a 2-bedroom home, if you put your price at like $5,000 a night, sure, the price is high, but the probability of booking is very, very low. So at this point, you're going to make close to zero. Um, Now, if you set the price somewhere in between, the probability is going to be between 0 and 1. And you can then find the point where you're going to make the most money in some ways, and it's going to be more than $20, hopefully. Um, Now, probability is very hard to wrap your head around, especially when looking at a future date when so many things are unknown. What's commonly used as a proxy, especially when looking at historic data, is occupancy rate. So if you look at your portfolio, if you look at a certain month, you can look at your occupancy rate and say that, okay, that's somewhat of a proxy of, okay, at these price points, how much did I get booked? Then you can kind of do these experiments or think about doing these experiments where you can say, okay, last year I was booked 80% at a given price. If I increase my price by 10% and my occupancy will reduce potentially because I increase my price, is it going to reduce by 5% or is it going to reduce by 50%? If it reduces only by 5%, effectively you can make more money. Now it's your decision uh, whether you want to gain that revenue, because it also comes at the cost of occupancy, and sometimes occupancy does matter. Like you also do want to, for market share kind of perspectives, you do want to like maintain good occupancy rates as well. But you have to think about, like, in many cases, I would take a 75% occupancy if it gives me like 5% more revenue overall. I have lesser operations, lesser overhead, and I'm making more money, right? Now, anytime you're doing any of these pricing levers or strategies, one of the good things is that as you learn more, you can keep adjusting prices. So whenever you do such experiments, which a lot of people do, you don't have to just say that, hey, I decided to set the price for next July at 10% higher and I won't touch it again. I'm going to see how this runs out. You can look at intermediate signals and say, hey, is it going as I expected? Am I going to be not very much booked at all? Am I still getting way more bookings than I expected? In which case, maybe I should increase it further. So that's very important for revenue management to understand that you can, of course, keep changing prices. Once you set them, that doesn't mean that you keep them there. Like you're not, uh, at least now that most of the distribution is online, you're not sending rate sheets uh, a year ahead to a lot of like travel agencies and things like that. You can keep changing rates. People look at what's the rate at the time of booking and things like that. Any questions around this? Right. if there are questions, to ping them, do send them over. Now, in terms of levers, what I've done here is that the bubbles that you see on the right, or the boxes you see on the right, are sort of the levers. And then on the left, what I've tried to classify is what drives those levers. So the first set is, even if you're not looking at anything else, you have your own past data from all the reservations you have taken over the years. And you can look at that data to figure out, uh, without any market information, you can take that data and say, okay, what's my high season, what's my low season, and I'll dive deeper into each of these as we go. But seasonal pricing, of course, is very important. Almost no markets have the same kind of demand across. Most beach markets, for example, in the Northern Hemisphere, will see July and August as their peaks. A lot of city markets see a dip in July and August because everybody is heading to the beach instead of going to the cities. Ski markets see, like, in ski season is their high. Some ski markets also see a second high during July and August in summer when people go for hiking. So it's very important to look at your own data and figure out, okay, what's very important in seasonal pricing is to recognize that it's not just high or low. There is also a shoulder season. And when I'm speaking about these as months, I wish I hadn't, because a lot of times I've seen this happen where June is classified as sort of May, June are classified as low season or shoulder season, but then entire June has the same price. And then come July 1, things bump up. What we have seen very often in data is guests don't care about calendars. They, like, the closer to July it is, the higher the price can be in June if you're in a beach area, for example. Um, you can look at your own data to understand day of week prices. You can look at, okay, are there holidays and events in the past? How much were we able to charge, and things like that. Now, the next segment is market data. So the market data segment in the last few years has gotten, like, the levers around market data have gotten a lot more sophisticated because a lot more data is available. For the same reason I mentioned that there are no published rate cards anywhere. Like, a lot of distribution is online, and what that allows for various services to do is look at that data and provide concise information about how different markets are doing in terms of occupancy, in terms of prices. And you can then look at that and say, okay, am I priced in the higher end of the market, in the lower end of the market? How is it by seasons, by day of week, and things like that? Market occupancy is also something very important. It conveys to us a lot of information, and I'll have more data on this as we go as well. Your own future data is something that you can look at to figure out where to make tweaks and where to make adjustments. So maybe out of all your listings, 2 of them are not getting well occupied. So, like, hey, I need to focus on these and adjust prices. Maybe in all your future dates in your entire portfolio, there are some dates that are just completely getting booked up. Maybe you didn't increase the prices enough. Then the portfolio occupancy based data will tell you about that kind of a thing. Now, your calendar is, if you look at the top 3, they are all about data. They're all about aggregating information. Your calendar, that one is not about aggregating data, but looking at your calendar and understanding certain metrics that, hey, when there's a gap, it's harder to book, or days next to a booking are have lesser exposure and things like that. The last one is broader policies. So this is not the top 4 in some ways are things that you can adjust as you go. Every new information that comes in, you should or you can adjust. Broader policies are things that you don't change very often. They are put in place with something in mind. So channel markups, like when you publish prices to different OTAs versus your own direct booking website, how much more do you want to charge on the OTAs to cover for the extra commissions? Do you want to do that or not? Uh, what kind of LOS pricing do you want? Like, if you give longer stay discounts, then that helps in many ways because it incentivizes longer bookings. Do you want to do that or not? Because your operations get smoother versus potentially you make less money. Which seasons do you want to do LOS pricing for? What kind of fee structures and things like that? So this is in one slide, I've tried to sort of put in everything to say like, hey, there are a lot of levers. Now, the question that comes out is, how do we start using these levers, or how do we start identifying when to use these levers?
Anurag, we have a question.
Yes. All right.
Ms. Patricia says, are there any outside data sources to use for pricing, visitor data, et cetera?
When you say visitor data, is it about like your own direct booking website and whether somebody visited and didn't book and things like that? Oh, I
There's
guess
not another
that's like
explanation. That's okay.
all
But
right.
if
Sounds good. Yeah, so when I
oh,
talked about
yes,
market,
it says yes.
got it. Okay, sounds good. So visitor data generally will have to come from your own direct booking websites because OTAs don't make that public all the time. Although sometimes you can log into the OTA and see how many people have viewed your listings and things like that. So you can tap into that data as well and try and understand, hey, a lot of people are looking at my listings but not booking them. Like what's happening? If they have put in certain dates, and I think there are some tools available now that also help you figure out how many times was a quote requested and a reservation made versus not. So I think Demand IQ is one of those which does it. I don't know too much about it just yet, but yeah, there are tools available that help you figure out some questions uh, around that as well. Yeah, I'm not covering those in this presentation just yet. Cool. Now, in terms of pricing levers, what I've tried to do is separating out in some ways two processes that a lot of revenue managers go through. So the first one is about setting rates, and think of it as right now we are in September 2021. For most managers that we work with, at least, the next 12 to 18 months of rates are already in place. And a lot of times they're looking at, okay, what rates do I want to set for, say, 2023 summer, for example, or spring? And what that's the first part. So like, what rates do I want to start off with? And then the second part is, okay, as the date gets closer, based on new information that I find out, the booking pace and things like that, which we'll talk about. Now the question is, okay, should I start adjusting, and how should I adjust them? So what I've done is I've broken down these two. Like the first section is about setting rates, and then the second one is about adjusting rates. So in terms of setting rates, one of the things that is very common in our industry is to look at your historic rates. So for example, for a property, to look at the rates that you had set last year and sort of put a 10% bump on it or a 5% bump on it and set the same rates for next year or the year after and things like that. And it's not a terrible strategy. Like if you have been in business and you have done well, those prices have worked for you, and you're sort of accounting for some amount of inflation and things like that and saying, hey, this has worked well for me so far. And I'm okay with at least setting a benchmark of like, yeah, let's start there. What has been working really well. Um, what I usually advocate for is don't, of course, don't disregard your past rates, but learn from your past rates and your past occupancy. So one of the common things that I mentioned earlier was this thing of like shoulder season. So June is, let's say in some location, June is shoulder season. Um, and historically, last year you had a rate that was somewhere between the low season rate and the high season rate set up for June. So say low season was selling for $300 a night and high season was selling for $600 a night. And for shoulder season, which is June, you set a rate of $450 a night. Now, what would be very useful for you to do is to go back and look at across your portfolio, how was June's occupancy? If you can get access to market data, also look at how was June's occupancy in the market and not just your portfolio. And you might find out that later part of June was way more occupied and than earlier part of June, as an example. Or even though they were about the same in terms of occupancy, later part got booked much earlier than the earlier part, which is also a sign that, hey, maybe the second half of June should have higher prices than the first half of June. So the more you segment, the more you find in some ways. And then, like I said, it's not just the occupancy. You also have to look at the lead time. Lead time is how soon did something book. So if a stay for summer in June got booked in January, that's a lead time of 5 months. Versus if it got booked in April, that's a lead time of 2 months. So generally speaking, very high demand seasons and dates tend to get booked far out. Of course, those kinds of trends have changed over time, but at least this year we saw some of those repeat as well. Like in many locations, high seasons got booked pretty far out. Now, just to aid I was saying about uh, differentiating between your high season and low season, and not just copying past rates but also learning from it, what's very important, what's very useful is to not just look at like broad metrics. So for example, the top chart here is looking at 2021 occupancy rates so far for a particular portfolio, and it's saying, okay, June and July in this location were pretty high, and then May was lower, and then April was lower. You could say that, okay, maybe these are your shoulder seasons in some ways, and then early part of the year, Jan, Feb, were low seasons. But if you break it down by week, you'll notice that, well, early part of March was actually low, and then mid-March is where there was a big peak due to spring break, almost as high as a summer. So uh, this is just an example that I think everybody knows. Everybody looks at data at a very even more granular level, right? The folks look at data at a date level, not even that. But what I was trying to highlight is uh, as you deep dive into data, more things come out. So when you look at a number, also think about what's going into that number, and can you break that number down by different metrics. That will help you figure out what might be going well, what might be going wrong. So for example, maybe there's a home in your portfolio that there was 80% booked over the course of 2020, and then you'll be like, hey, it did great. But then you ask for a breakdown of like, okay, can we look at it at a monthly level? And it turns out that maybe September, October were like almost not booked, which is why it was 80% and not closer to 100%. 80% itself is fine if it's scattered around, but if there are 2 solid months that were just not booked, you then need to find out, okay, what happened there? Was the demand low? Was something off with the property? Something else, and things like that. The second, so we talked about how looking at your own data can be very helpful in setting rates for, and we are talking setting rates for far out dates. The second strategy that we have seen some folks use is what's called sort of looking at the market data and then trying to say, okay, in this and looking at market data is important because it tells you how flexible is the market. So going back to this example, if you were close to 100% booked at a certain rate, you could potentially think about, maybe I can bump my rates up because being sort of 95% booked is great, but that also indicates that you can increase the rates a little bit and the market can still take it. But how much can you increase? Those kind of questions get answered when you also look at the market data to say, okay, so I'm looking at sort of, think of this as today on the left. And of course, this looks like a very weekend heavy market where the blue area is sort of the higher end of the market in some ways, the prices of the higher end of the market. And then the yellow area is sort of the lower end of the market. Where those two meet is sort of the middle of the market. So a lot of times what we hear is, okay, we would rather be, if my property is sort of a middle property in some ways in terms of quality, like an average property, we've heard customers say, like, shouldn't we be priced in the middle, like right around where this is, because hey, like that's the middle of the market and my property is pretty average. Or if you have an exceptional property, for it to be closer to the 75th percentile price, right? What we generally see work well or work better is to instead not just look at what other people are setting their rates at, but also look at what kind of occupancy trends exist in the market or existed in the market. So for example, during high season, when 90% of the homes are going to get booked, even if you're an average property, it doesn't make sense to say, hey, I should stay in the middle of the market, especially if nobody else is adjusting their rates. You can be a lot higher. If almost everything is going to get booked, you can raise your prices and still expect to get booked, in which case you're making more money. On the flip side, when it is low season and only say 25% of the homes are going to get booked, which means 25% occupancy. Now the question is, even though you might be a sort of middle of the market property in terms of quality and amenities and things like that, do you want to be at the median price and have a chance that you don't get booked, or do you want to get slightly lower in the lower price brackets and have a better chance of bookings? And of course, you should still very much consider what's the lowest rate that still is profitable for you, that makes sense for you, that makes sense for the owner and things like that. But what I wanted to highlight was like that just looking at the market comps and trying to be somewhere in between doesn't work. I mean, it of course works, but what works better is identify what dates are going to be very, very well booked. So like peak holidays, you can be even higher than sort of the 75th percentile of the market as an average property and still expect to get booked. And again, this is uh, we are talking about setting rates. If you're not getting booked, then as the date gets closer, as you get more data, you can then say, okay, I should probably look at lowering those rates because out of my 50 homes, only like 5 of them are booked and it's 3 months out. I was expecting this holiday to get booked faster and things like that. The last thing when setting rates is, again, I talked briefly about lead time, but for every owner, this is unique, but you have to think about your and your owner's risk profiles. So I talked about how we are setting rates like a year out or more than a year out, and there are folks who prefer to get bookings early rather than late, and so like the folks who prefer to take bookings early like to know that yeah they already have some like bookings lined up, there's some revenue lined up. The ones who are okay with getting booked late might have seen some market data that suggested that, hey, like plenty of bookings come within the last 3 months, so you don't have to worry about not getting booked a year out and things like that. And it's also useful to just be able to show what kind of market you are in and what kind of booking profile is there. So for example, if you look at this chart, each line or each column on the x-axis is sort of a booking window. And this suggests that, okay, there's a fair amount of bookings that come in 6+ months out. But in terms of total number of like bookings, it seems like less than sort of 20%. So if I'm not booked more than 6 months out, I'm okay. I shouldn't get worried. But if it's less than 2 weeks out, if a date is less than 2 weeks out and my calendar is sitting empty, I would start thinking about, okay, like where did my pricing go wrong? How much should I lower it now so that I'm able to get at least some of these residual bookings that are going to pour in late? And this is a very representative chart. Like I've seen plenty of markets where like it's skewed very much to the right. People like to book in that market very early. And a lot of urban markets are skewed to the left where like people know there are enough homes in this market, enough hotels in this market, and they're not planning a big vacation, but they're planning something a lot more work related where a hotel would also work, in which case people say like, I'll wait till last minute before booking because it gives them more flexibility. They know there's enough supply unless there's a big holiday or something. So again, you have to look at your market and understand how that works. You have to look at your owners profiles and your own risk profile as well. Also, taking a lot of last minute bookings is sort of cumbersome for your operations. You suddenly you don't know whether a check-in or check-out is going to happen or how many of them are going to happen till very last minute. So your own operations and risk profiles also matter a lot when doing any of this. Cool. Now I want to jump into the adjusting rate part, which which I feel is very exciting, at least to me. Um, the there are two there are two sort of there are two broad kinds of things that we look at when looking at adjusting rates for the future. One is identifying dates. So each future date is sort of an entity on its own, and you can adjust. You can look at if you only have one property, it's very hard for you to tell uh, whether a future date is in demand or not, because uh, that one property is either booked or is it not booked. If it is booked, you don't know if it was in high demand or somebody was just planning something very early and happened to choose your listing or something else. If it is not booked, again, you don't know eventually whether it might get booked or not. So it's very hard to tell if you just have one listing, or one property, that a demand is in high demand or a date is in high demand or not. But if you're managing a portfolio of listings, or if you have access to market data, what you can look at is what we call, what everybody calls pacing in some ways. And what that pacing essentially says, the closer a date is, the more booked you expect it to be if all dates were equal. So as an example here, you will see that this weekend, and this is a slide from DAM, so which is it's starting on August 15th. This weekend here is very highly booked, but then most weekends will be dropping down from that point on. And when I draw that line, it seems to me that, hey, there must be something happening on this weekend. Why people are booking so much? And I'm like, okay. And then I keep going down, and then things drop off in October, and then this one seems fine. So like maybe there's not much happening here. But what really catches the eye is that, like, hey, November 7th, like this weekend is just out of the box. So uh, what looking at date level aggregate data, if you look at this for one listing, it doesn't give you enough information. But if you look at all listings in a market, or if you look at it from your own portfolio, this kind of shows, okay, I kind of have a sense of which dates are booking well, which ones are not booking well. And that tells you where you can increase prices for your properties and where you should potentially reduce prices for your properties. Now, this particular chart is looking at market data, and I think this one is for Galveston, and I have no clue what happens in Galveston or what's happening in Galveston early November to do this. But one of the other important things that you can look at, so we are looking at occupancy here, and this is kind of the same chart, but I've also overlaid prices. So in this chart, the gray line in the bottom one is the market occupancy. The red line is your occupancy. The blue line, the blue area, like we had discussed before, is sort of the higher end of the market price. The yellow area is sort of the lower end of the market. And then the black line is what your prices are at right now. So you'll see that, okay, for these high demand dates, this property manager has higher rates than the market, higher end even, for this, whatever this weekend was. They also have it for the early November event. What you'll also notice is that the market seems to be thinking that the week before this big event in November, in the market, it seems like some of the higher end properties have raised their prices. Now, we briefly talked about how, like, one of the pricing strategies that we've seen people do is sort of copying or trying to see, okay, trying to be in the middle of the market. One of the reasons we highly recommend not doing that is also, if you look at the occupancy, neither the market and nor your own listings seem to be showing any booking activity that that would tell you that, hey, you should raise prices during midweek there. Now, does that mean that it's very much possible that whoever has increased their prices in the market probably knows something, or probably they don't, but at least uh, in your occupancy, you're not seeing any signs yet. If you are looking at this data, maybe you go hop on Google and be like, hey, is there something happening? Like, why are other people raising prices? And if you don't find anything, and if you don't see any signs, there's no need to worry in some ways. One of the other things you'll notice in here is, it seems like um, for these big events, generally speaking, we have raised, this property manager has raised the prices a lot, but in terms of occupancy, we are trailing a little bit. So here, like the market is higher than us, the market is higher than us, and for all other dates, it seems like we are either above the market or right around the market. So, and that goes into in some ways your expectation or your knowledge of the market as well. So if you know that there is a big holiday or a big event coming up, and from the previous years, you can tell that, hey, for this particular event, a lot of bookings happen last minute as well. This is totally fine to do. It's okay to be below the market and priced higher when it is 3 weeks out, knowing that a lot of people will book and it, the market will get fully booked, and then you will be sort of people will eventually book you as well. Whereas if you know that, hey, this is a place where people like to book, like there is nobody who books in the last 2 weeks, then I would say, hey, I should take some corrective action here, because we are 3 weeks away, not expecting too many more people to book, um, and we potentially have made more money, a decent amount of revenue because we were priced way higher than the market and have decent occupancy. But now let's adjust those prices and lower our rates and get whoever is left trying to make those bookings. All right. Now we spoke about identifying dates. So if you think about what I'm looking at is in some ways a table. So each row is a property and each column is a date. Um, and I can look at each date, and it looks like in here I have 6 properties and 5 of them are already booked. So something like 83% occupancy and so on. And if I look at this chart, this data, by looking at my aggregate occupancy across all dates, I would be very happy. I would be like, everything is above 80%, things are going fine. But it's only when I break down into individual calendars that I realize that, hey, there is one calendar, when there's one listing right here, which seems to be just not getting any bookings. I need to do something about it. So what's important is not just to look at aggregate data, but also look at data that's broken down by each property, by each home. Now, this part I feel in our industry does not need a mention almost, because almost everybody that I speak to uh, does look at every home that they have once in a like every week or things like that. But I just wanted to highlight that when you start looking at data, it's very easy to sort of get lost in the data and stop noticing sort of the micro trends that might need attention as well. One of the other um, one of the other things that is very important to look at is, again, when you're looking at occupancy level data, this property will show up somewhere around 60% occupancy. And when you look at that 60% occupancy, maybe a lot of other homes have similar occupancy, maybe the market has similar occupancy, you'll be like, okay, it's doing reasonably well. What you should look at, or everyone should look at, is how can I, like, what is stopping it from going further up? And in this case, it's very obvious in some ways that all the weekends are the high demand days. Like, again, this calendar is from Galveston. So where the weekends are high demand, they get booked early. Once they get booked, the demand that was going to book those 7-night stays, and we don't know yet in this market, we'll see the data soon, how many of those stays are there. But the folks who are going to book longer stays can no longer book that. So like anybody who was going to book a 4-night stay from the 26th to the 30th can't book it, because there is this 2-night stay sitting in between that may be booked 6 months out. Anybody who wanted to book a weekly stay anywhere in this month is not going to be able to, because the calendar is very fragmented. So the middle dates, in some ways, they already were low demand midweek days, but once your weekends get booked up, the chances of them booking go even lower. So like now, what you need to look at to sort of get to the bottom of this in some ways, and to start addressing this, is what does my demand for those dates look like? So
I
this,
have a question for you, Anurag.
yep.
It says, is there anything you see over and over again that leads to a higher priced rented property?
Okay. Are we thinking about like amenities or location or things like that? Or are we thinking about like, sorry, can you repeat that question?
Sure. Is there anything you see over and over again that leads to a higher priced rented property? Amenities, pools, hot tubs, king size beds, etc.
Got it. So the answer very much depends on where a listing or where a property is, and where it's located, and a lot of things like that. We have data tools where you can go and find that answer. I don't know if I can give one answer for everywhere. Also, even if you specify a location right now, I won't be able to answer. But if you email me the question with your location, I'll be able to send you something if that works.
I'll send her your email.
All right, sounds good. Sorry, like that answer was a complete non-answer, but that's the best I could come up with right now. Uh, cool. Yeah, so now talking about fragmented calendars, one of the things that's very useful to look at is market data. So one of the things we have seen when you're looking at your own data, for example, a lot of times in terms of length of stay trends or any other kinds of trends, one of the things that happens is your data is in some ways censored data. As an example, if your minimum stay has always been 4 nights, um, you won't know by looking at your own data how much more demand there existed for shorter, like 2 or 3 night stays. Uh, to answer something like that, now you have to kind of go back to market data and say, okay, I know my properties have 4 night minimums, but plenty of other homes in the area are either owner managed or some other property manager manages them, in which case they might have different restrictions. Maybe I can get an answer to, are there other kinds of, like, how much demand am I missing out on by having a 4 night minimum? So one of the things that you can look at is, again, when you see market data, you can sometimes break it down to say, okay, how many 1 night stays are happening, how many 2 night stays are happening, how many 3 to 4 night stays are happening, and so on. Now, I've picked the same market throughout. So this is the same market where you see a peak here, and I think the November peak is probably missing outside the screen here. But what you can look at is, in this market, of course, weekends are heavy in demand, but very few of those bookings are with 2 night stays. A big chunk of those weekend bookings are 3 to 4 night stays. And then there is some reasonable amount of sort of 5 and 6 night stays, and then 7 to 14 night stays as well. So if I want to now think about what can I do to not have a scattered graph, to a scattered calendar, to not have these 2 night bookings, and at the same time make sure that I'm not missing out on too much demand, you can look at data like this. And one of the things I spot, for example, here is that um, one, a lot of these, like, some demand has started building up in October, but a very small portion of that is 2 night stays. So at the minimum, one of the things you could do if you look at data like this is to say, okay, let's have my weekends be like 3 nights or 4 nights minimum. And only when it is last minute will I open those up to 2 night stays, for example. So what you're trying to say is, if somebody books more than, say, 4 months out, have your weekends be 4 night minimums. People who are looking for longer stays will potentially book your stay. You won't get a 2 night stay that blocks other people from booking longer stays later. And as it gets closer, you can then say, hey, like, if the weekend is not booked and it's like 2 months out, I'll open it up to 3 nights. And if it's not booked and if it's under 2 weeks, then I'm like, okay, very little demand left. Come take a 2 night booking. Like, I'll take whatever demand comes at this point. Now, the same data that was shown here, I've plotted the same data in a different way, where this is breaking down what kind of length of stay bookings come by lead time. So one of the things you'll notice is far out, 6+ months out, a lot more stays tend to be longer, which is something we have seen in plenty of markets. And this is one answer I can give across all markets. Longer stays tend to happen farther out because guests who are booking with with their families, extended families, planning out a major vacation, they tend to plan it out farther because they have to coordinate a lot of other folks. Um, Whereas the bookings that happen very last minute tend to be shorter because, again, if I decide just now that I want to take something, like go somewhere for this weekend, uh, potentially I'm not going to take Monday or Friday off. I'll just go for the weekend, or I have a higher chance of doing that. Some people will do it, but that means that, okay, if I'm very last minute, it helps to lower my minimum stay to attract more potential bookings that would not otherwise be able to book. Whereas if it's far out, I should try to increase my minimum stay, get those bookings that are longer. That will help me not have a scattered calendar. So, like, especially like for a big holiday or a big event, you don't want your minimum, like for Thanksgiving or Christmas, New Year's, depending on the location. Again, you don't want your minimum stay to be 2 nights, especially far out. Like, if there is a chance to get a 7-night bookings, I would rather have that. And then if it's not booked, as it gets closer, you can keep lowering those things. Check-in, check-out restrictions are another lever that a lot of people use, where this is common in beach markets in the US, where um, during summer, you can say there's plenty of demand for 7-night stays and Saturday to Saturday 7-night stays. So if you just make it 7-night minimum, you potentially get somebody booking from Monday to Monday, in which case, um, if the rest of the market is more Saturday to Saturday, you potentially have 2 gaps on either side, right? So, but if you know your market really well and you're like, everybody in this market wants to book Saturday to Saturday, then you can go ahead with that. Uh, a lot of times those Saturday to Saturday bookings also happen further out. So as it gets closer, you can start relaxing those. You can also look at market data to say, hey, like, by having a 7-night minimum over summer, how much demand am I missing out on? If there is, like, if more than half the bookings are shorter than 7 nights, maybe you should consider like increasing the price and lowering the minimum stay. Like, it's very much possible that you'll make the same amount of money with fewer days of stays, in which case your cleaning crew has a better chance of turning over rather than doing everything on one compressed Saturday and things like that. And then the last lever uh, that is, I hope, will become more common as we go forward, but it hasn't yet, is called length of stay pricing. And one example of length of stay pricing that's very common right now is weekly and monthly discounts. So, for example, your price is $300. If somebody books a week-long stay, then you give a 10% discount. If somebody gives stays for a month, you give a 20% discount. And these discounts should not be arbitrary. They should be based uh, in some math. For example, if you're giving a 20% discount for a monthly stay, um, you should look at that calendar month and be like, okay, I was expecting this month to be booked 60% because usually people only book weekends. But if somebody is going to book my entire month, giving a 20% discount might make sense, because then uh, you've sold all the nights. You potentially, not potentially, you should only give a discount if you are expecting to make more revenue by giving that discount in some ways. But if earlier you were only booking weekends, and by giving a 20% discount, everything gets booked, then you are going to make more money. So you should do that. But then what's also coming up is sort of lower levels of length of stay pricing, where you can say, I usually don't take a 2-night stay, but if I can put a premium on it and say, like, a 2-night stay has a 50% premium to where the revenue comes out to be same as a 3-night stay, uh, maybe then it becomes attractive for me to do such things. So also try to get sort of, if you can, look at the math, like look at what you have set as your weekly and monthly discounts. And if your PMS or the OTAs allow it, look at, can you also enable length of stay pricing? Like, one of the length of stay pricing options that that we do even without the OTAs allowing for it is things like your minimum stay is 3 nights. Sometimes you get 2 bookings and there are 2 nights sitting in between. Now, usually you would say I don't want to take 2-night stays, but only in situations when the 2-night stay is between 2 bookings and there is nothing else possible. You could say, okay, I'll take a 2-night booking if the price is bumped up by 50%. So things like that, if those make sense, um, even without a full-blown LOS pricing being allowed, I mean, those can be very useful revenue levers. Cool. I think we have covered a lot, but to recap, there's a lot of data available. There is your own data, there is the market data, both for the past and for the future. You also have calendars to review once in a while, and you have to set your broader policies. And based on all of this data, there is plenty that you can do in terms of fine-tuning your pricing strategy, adjusting your rates to where my general recommendation is get as much data as you can lay your hands on. Look at your own portfolio, where it's performing well, where it's not performing well, and choose one of these to start with. So one of the things that can happen very easily is you drown in all of this and then not know where to go with it. But look at when you review the performance of your own portfolio in the last year or in the coming months, look at, okay, go through each of these levers and ask yourself, like, okay, could this help me in some ways? Could this have helped me? And if the answer is yes, then go look at your future calendars and look at your future data and see, like, okay, how can I apply this in what's happening in my portfolio right now? With that, yeah, want to open up for questions. My email is right there. So if you have questions as you think through this afterwards, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me directly as well.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for taking your time with us today. If there are no questions, I'm not seeing any immediately come through. I guess we'll wrap it up with that. Everybody, if you take a look at your chat, we are extending a 40% discount on the DARM video packages. The link is in the chat box, and you have a promo code specifically for you. So that's that. All right. Thank you, Anurag.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca, for organizing this, and thank you everyone for attending this. I'm really hoping this was useful. The hour. If any questions come up, feel free to email me.
Great. Everybody have a great day.